Bullies choked a black girl. Seconds later, she had them pleading for mercy. It was just a hallway. Just another stretch of lockers, students chatting between classes, teachers walking briskly past, heads down, eyes forward. But for Grace Harrison, it was the moment her life took an unexpected turn, the moment she realized things were never going to be the same. "That's it. You're done," Zachary Reynolds said, his tone full of malice. He was tall, athletic, the star quarterback, the type of person everyone at school admired. And Grace, she was just another black girl. Invisible, insignificant. Another target for the popular crowd. The students gathered around, some whispering, others watching closely, but none of them moved. None of them stepped in to help. They never did. "Please, Zachary, just leave me alone," Grace said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder would make it worse. Her heart raced with the familiar feeling of being the outcast, the one who always had to shrink into the background. Zachary smirked, stepping even closer. The crowd seemed to shrink around them. It was as if everything else in the world disappeared, and it was just the two of them. "You think you can stop me?" he taunted, leaning in, towering over her. "You think you have any say in this?" But this time something inside Grace shifted. She had stayed quiet for too long. She had been afraid for too long. Today she was done hiding. In one swift motion she pushed him back, not much, but enough to make him stumble. Enough to create the tiniest bit of space, enough to remind herself that she could take control. The crowd gasped, momentarily stunned. Zachary blinked, surprised by her boldness. But then his anger flared. "You're dead!" He spat his face, twisting with rage. And that's when everything happened so fast. It wasn't the first time Zachary had cornered her like this. It wasn't the first time his words had stung. His insults had cut deep. Grace had learned to ignore it, to live with the taunts, the cruel jokes. She had learned how to fade into the walls, to become a ghost. But today was different. She couldn't fade away. Not this time. Zachary's grip came without warning. His large hands found her throat, tightening around it. Grace gasped for air, her body trembling in panic. She reached up, clawing at his hands, but they didn't budge. The more she struggled, the tighter he held on. Her vision blurred, her chest felt like it was on fire. She couldn't breathe. This was it. This was the moment she would lose everything. But then something caught her eye. Logan Peterson, one of Zachary's friends, stood off to the side with his phone raised, recording the scene like it was some kind of twisted performance. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. They weren't just hurting her, they were making a spectacle of it. They weren't just trying to hurt her physically. They wanted to break her spirit, to make her a joke. And she wasn't going to let that happen. With every ounce of strength she had left, Grace did what she had to. She kicked out her foot, striking Zachary's knee. The sudden jolt caused him to falter. Grace didn't wait. She seized the moment, using his own momentum against him. In a swift, calculated movement, she forced his arm behind his back. The sound of a joint snapping filled the air, a sharp, sudden crack that sent a ripple through the crowd. Zachary screamed, recoiling in pain, as his arm hung limp at his side. The students around them were frozen in shock, their phones already out, capturing the aftermath. Grace stood there, gasping for breath, her body trembling from the surge of adrenaline. The attack had ended. She had defended herself. But none of them came to her aid. No one moved to help her. The students stood watching, waiting for what would happen next. Zachary, clutching his wrist, looked up at her in disbelief. You broke my wrist." Grace looked down at him, her voice calm but firm. "You were choking me." It wasn't the words she wanted to say. She wanted to scream, to cry, to ask why no one ever stepped in. But she didn't. Instead, she said the one thing that would change everything. "I'm sorry you're hurt," she said, her voice quiet, steady. "But I'm not sorry I defended myself." The hallway erupted into chaos. Students scattered, muttering among themselves. Phones were raised, capturing the moment, spreading the story far beyond the walls of the school. Grace didn't wait for anyone's approval. She didn't care about their whispers or their judgment. She walked out of the building, Olivia Chen right behind her, holding up her phone. "I'm live," Olivia whispered, looking at Grace for confirmation. Grace nodded, her throat raw from the attack, but her mind sharp. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm okay." But deep inside, she wasn't sure if she would ever be okay again. The footage of the confrontation quickly went viral. Comments flooded in from every direction, the numbers climbing exponentially. People were watching. People were listening. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a message. Grace's phone buzzed. "You're trending," a text from an unknown number read. "Check the news." The video had spread faster than wildfire. It was no longer just a fight. It was a movement. Her heart raced, and a shiver ran down her spine. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was her chance to be seen. "Tell them," Olivia urged, holding the camera steady. Grace hesitated for a moment, then turned to face the camera. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she steadied herself. She had a choice. She could stay silent. She could shrink back into the shadows. Or she could speak. Speak for herself. Speak for Emma Rodriguez. Speak for every single person who had ever been pushed to the edge and had nowhere to turn. "My name is Grace Harrison," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I'm a senior at Westfield High. For years I watched students get bullied, harassed, attacked, while nothing was done. I stayed quiet. I stayed invisible. I stayed silent. Even when my best friend Emma Rodriguez begged for help." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. "Even when the bullying drove her to the point where she couldn't take it anymore, even when we lost her. Emma's death wasn't just an accident. It was the result of years of neglect." Grace swallowed hard. She could feel the eyes of the world on her, but she couldn't look away. "I made 2 promises. One to my brother to never fight unless I had no other choice, and one to Emma to make sure no one else would ever have to suffer like she did." She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she held the phone up, facing the camera. "Today, Zachary Reynolds tried to choke me unconscious while Logan Peterson filmed it and Hunter Jackson stood by. I defended myself. I'm not sorry." The stream exploded in views, the numbers climbing higher and higher with every passing second. Grace's words, raw, unfiltered, were reaching people. People who had been waiting for someone to speak up. People who understood the fear, the anger, the helplessness that came with being ignored, being silenced. And for the first time in her life, Grace Harrison wasn't invisible anymore. By the time Grace left the school, the video had been shared across platforms, sparking conversations, debates, and protests. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a movement. This was the beginning of something bigger than her. Part 2. The Weight of the Truth. Grace's phone buzzed once again, snapping her out of the daze she'd fallen into after leaving the school. She glanced down at the screen, an unfamiliar number. Her hands, still trembling from the fight, hovered over the screen before answering. "Hello," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Grace, it's Olivia. We've got a problem." Her heart skipped a beat. Olivia's voice was tense, urgent. "What's happening?" Grace asked, her pulse racing. The silence on the other end lasted only a second before Olivia spoke again. "The video. It's everywhere. But there's a twist. Zachary's parents are calling it an unprovoked attack. They're spinning the story. The media's already picking it up." Grace's stomach turned. The truth was out there, but she knew how quickly lies could be manipulated. The very people who had stood by and watched would now be painting her as the aggressor. She could already hear the whispers. The black girl violent, out of control. "I knew this would happen," Grace muttered under her breath, clutching the phone tighter. They'll twist it, make it look like I started it. I have to be careful. They'll try, but we have the evidence, Olivia said. The full footage is up. The whole thing. It's all there. We've got 100,000 views now, and it's only getting bigger. Grace took a breath, trying to calm the knot forming in her stomach. I know. But the video's not the problem. The problem is the people who are going to believe them anyway. The next day, the school was a minefield. Grace walked through the halls with her head down, avoiding eye contact. She'd expected the whispers, but hearing them so loud, so clear, made her feel small. It was as if the entire school had turned against her in an instant. Did you hear she broke his wrist? Yeah, I heard. I would have done the same if someone was choking me. Isn't she the one who… She heard bits and pieces of their conversations, but she kept moving, eyes focused on the floor hands tucked in her jacket pockets. And then out of nowhere, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Grace. She froze. Zachary Reynolds. His arm in a sling, walked up to her, flanked by his friends Logan and Hunter. His face was still bruised, his expression twisted with frustration. He looked like he was trying to decide whether to yell or to intimidate her. I'm not talking to you, Grace said quietly without looking up. Zachary stepped closer. You don't get it, do you? His voice was low, dangerous. You think you're some kind of hero, but you just ruined my life, my future. Grace lifted her head, meeting his gaze for the first time. Your life. My best friend is dead, Zachary. My future, you were part of what destroyed hers. Don't act like you're the victim here. The words hung in the air, charged with the weight of everything Grace had been holding back. Zachary clenched his jaw, but Grace could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was brief, fleeting, but it was there. She could feel the tension rising, the animosity crackling between them. But this wasn't just about her and him anymore. This was bigger than them both. He glanced at Logan and Hunter for backup, but they said nothing. They just stood there, silent and unsure. You have no idea what it's like to be someone like me. Grace continued, her voice sharp but steady. You think you can just walk through life doing whatever you want, leaving a trail of pain behind you, and then when it finally catches up to you, you play the victim. Zachary looked at her, eyes narrowed. You don't know what you're talking about. You're a nobody. I'm a somebody, and you just took that away from me. Grace exhaled slowly, her voice low, the anger starting to fade into something colder. I didn't take anything from you. I didn't ask for this. You did this to yourself. You tried to choke me. You made me fight back. And now you want to pretend I'm the bad guy. Maybe you are the bad guy. Logan spoke up for the first time, his tone dismissive, as if Grace wasn't even worth his time. I mean, what kind of person breaks someone's wrist? The words stung more than she cared to admit, but she forced herself to stay calm. The kind of person who doesn't die when someone's choking them, she replied coolly. A few students who had been listening to the exchange murmured among themselves. Grace could feel their eyes on her, and it made her sick to her stomach. She wasn't just fighting Zachary now. She was fighting the whole school, the entire system that had failed her, and so many others. I didn't ask for this fight, but you pushed me into it, Grace continued. You pushed me, and you pushed Emma until there was nothing left. You want me to apologize for surviving? I'm not going to do that. Not anymore. Zachary, Logan, and Hunter just stared at her, unable to form a response. Before anyone could say anything else, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. The crowd around them slowly dispersed, leaving behind a charged silence that weighed on Grace like a physical presence. Later that day, Grace found herself in Principal Murray's office once again. This time it wasn't just her. Zachary's parents had made their way to the school, furious, demanding action. The air was thick with tension, and Grace could practically feel the battle lines being drawn. Zachary's mother, a woman in her 40s with a tight smile and a posture that screamed authority, stood by the desk, arms crossed. You don't understand, she said, her voice sharp. Zachary has a future, a scholarship. Do you know what this means for him? Grace's jaw clenched. She didn't respond immediately, but her thoughts were like a thunderstorm in her mind. What about Emma's future? What about all the other kids who get trampled by people like your son every day? I'm sorry your son is hurt, Grace said slowly, the words feeling like they'd been forced from her mouth. But I didn't ask for any of this. The conversation dragged on with Zachary's mother demanding Grace be punished, even going so far as to call for her suspension. But Grace knew the truth couldn't be hidden for long. Principal Murray cleared his throat. We'll need to look into this further, but this is a serious matter, Miss Harrison. His gaze shifted to Zachary's parents, before finally landing back on Grace. A physical altercation like this could have severe consequences. As she sat there, she could feel the weight of the moment. Everyone was looking for someone to blame. And as always, it was easier to blame the one who had been hurt. By the time Grace stepped out of the office, the weight of the world seemed to follow her. Word had already spread that Zachary was telling his side of the story, painting her as the villain in this saga. And Grace couldn't escape the feeling that she was about to become the target of everything. The days that followed were a blur of media attention, rumors, and whispers. Grace couldn't escape it. No matter where she went, there was someone with a phone, someone with an opinion. The video had gone viral, and now the world seemed to be divided into two camps, those who supported Grace, and those who painted her as nothing more than an angry, out-of-control student. The comments on Olivia's live stream continued to flood in the numbers, ticking higher by the minute. Every time Grace checked her phone, the view count had grown now well over 200,000, with more pouring in. She couldn't keep up with the flood of messages, the barrage of opinions. She's a hero. Why isn't this girl getting a medal? The school should be ashamed of themselves. Then the darker ones, the ones that made Grace feel sick to her stomach. Black girl attacks white student, gets away with it. She's just using the self-defense excuse to hurt him. She's a thug. Grace felt the weight of those words press down on her heavier than any bruise, more damaging than any physical pain. She knew the world was watching, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for the moment when she would break. It was during lunch when the next wave hit. Grace had just sat down with Olivia when she noticed a few students from her class standing near the door, whispering among themselves. She recognized the familiar faces, Zachary's friends, Logan and Hunter. They weren't looking at her, but she could feel their eyes boring into the back of her skull. "You've got to be kidding me," Olivia muttered under her breath. "They're here looking for a fight." Grace exhaled sharply. "I'm not in the mood, Liv." "Don't worry. We've got this." Olivia said, her tone quiet but firm. "We just need to stay calm." But Grace knew that calm wasn't going to work anymore. They weren't in the classroom anymore. This was real life, and in real life things didn't get solved just by keeping your cool, not when you were the target. Zachary's friends stepped into the cafeteria, their voices loud enough for everyone to hear. Logan sneered. "So the hero thinks she's invincible now, huh?" Hunter, the one who had been silent through much of the whole ordeal, spoke up this time, his words cutting like glass. "You don't think you're going to get away with it, right? Breaking someone's wrist. That's not how it works in the real world." Grace stood up slowly, trying to control the anger building in her chest. She could feel the weight of every single eye in the room on her. "No one's getting away with anything," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You think it's all a game? You think bullying people and getting away with it is just a joke? You think I'm the villain here?" Her eyes moved from Logan to Hunter. "You were part of it. You filmed it. You watched it happen. And now you're here to pretend you're the victim." The words hit harder than she expected. Logan took a step back, eyes narrowing. You don't get to say that. You don't get to make us out to be the bad guys. Grace shook her head. I don't need to make anyone anything. You've already done that yourself. You tried to choke me. Zachary tried to kill me. And now you're here acting like I'm the one who's wrong for defending myself. You think I want this. You think I wanted to fight back. Olivia stood beside her, now joining in. No one asked for this, but this is what happens when the school ignores everything when the system fails. This isn't about us versus them. It's about standing up for what's right when the world tells you to stay quiet. Hunter, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, but his words were different. Less sure, less confident. I didn't think it would go this far, he muttered almost to himself. I didn't think people would actually listen. Grace's eyes met his, her gaze unwavering. Well, they're listening now. They're listening because they know it's time for the truth to come out. The cafeteria fell silent. It wasn't just Grace speaking anymore. It was something much bigger, something the entire school had ignored for far too long. The truth. The consequences. But just as quickly as the silence fell, it was broken. That's enough. A loud voice interrupted the tension. Grace turned to see Principal Murray standing at the entrance of the cafeteria, flanked by a security guard. His face was flushed, his eyes wide with frustration. Miss Harrison, I need to speak with you. Now. The walk to the principal's office felt like a march to her doom. The crowd of students watched as Grace passed by, their faces unreadable. A few exchanged glances. A few whispered. The whispers followed her all the way down the hallway. It wasn't just about what had happened anymore. It was about what was happening. And what was happening was change. Principal Murray's office door closed behind her with a soft thud, but the tension inside was thick enough to suffocate. Murray was pacing back and forth, his voice barely containing his anger. You've made a scene, Miss Harrison. A big one. The media's calling, parents are complaining, the school board is breathing down my neck, and you've been stirring up even more trouble. He stopped pacing and turned to face her. This can't go on. Grace stood tall, her back straight. It's too late to stop it now. You should have stepped in a long time ago. You should have done something when people like Zachary were hurting others. You're making it worse, he snapped. Do you realize the kind of attention this is bringing? Do you realize the damage this is causing to the school's reputation? Reputation. Grace scoffed, her anger rising once again. What about the students you've failed? What about Emma? What about all the other students who have been tortured by people like Zachary, but were too afraid to speak up because they knew you wouldn't care? The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Principal Murray looked almost stunned. It wasn't the first time someone had confronted him, but it felt different this time. Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. You've let this happen, Mr. Murray. You've let kids like Zachary get away with it. You didn't protect us. You didn't protect me. And now you want me to apologize for surviving. You want me to be quiet. Murray opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stood up straighter, her voice unwavering. I'm not apologizing for anything. I'm done being silent. As Grace left the principal's office, she realized something. This fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. And even though she couldn't control what would happen next, she could control what she did. And she wasn't going to back down. But as she stepped back into the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The weeks that followed felt like a never-ending storm. The media frenzy wasn't just about the incident anymore, it was about everything. The story of Grace Harrison, the girl who broke a bully's wrist in self-defense, had become a symbol of resistance, a symbol of survival. And for the first time in her life, Grace felt the weight of something much larger than herself pressing against her shoulders. Her school was under scrutiny, and so were the authorities. The backlash against Principal Murray grew louder with each passing day. Students in the halls began to look at Grace differently, some with admiration, others with fear. She was the outcast and the hero all at once. It wasn't long before the call came. "Miss Harrison," a calm voice said over the phone. "This is Officer Martinez. I need to speak with you about the ongoing investigation. It's time to make some decisions." Grace's stomach tightened. She hadn't spoken to the police in weeks, not since that first meeting in the principal's office when everything seemed so out of control. Her brother Daniel had told her to be cautious. She'd already done everything she needed to in self-defense. But the truth was, she hadn't fully understood what this would mean. When Grace arrived at the police station, she found her parents sitting in the waiting room. Her mom looked worried, arms crossed tightly. Her dad's face was stern, but there was something else there too. Pride. "You okay?" Daniel asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room. "I think so," Grace replied, though her heart was beating in her chest. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "Whatever happens, just remember that." She nodded, but the weight of the decision was sinking in. Officer Martinez led her into a small room, his face serious. "Miss Harrison," he began, "we've reviewed the footage, we've spoken to witnesses. You acted in self-defense. Legally, there's no question, but I want you to understand what comes next." Grace swallowed hard. "What's next?" "You've become a symbol," Martinez said, leaning forward. "And whether or not we file charges against the other boys, you'll need to be prepared for the fallout. From them, from the school, from everyone who has an opinion on this." She nodded. "I'm ready." He paused, his voice softening. "The truth is, there's no easy way out of this. But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing alone. You've made your choices. Now you have to live with them. Back at school, things were unraveling faster than anyone could manage. The pressure from parents, the media, and even teachers was mounting. There were meetings, apologies, and statements, none of it making a real difference. Grace wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the bullies, not of the consequences. She had already fought the hardest battle she had fought for herself. And in the end, she had won. The days that followed were a blur of headlines, interviews, and meetings. Grace's life had shifted overnight from a quiet senior year to a whirlwind of intense scrutiny. The media followed her every move, dissecting the video, her words, her actions, as if they could find something, anything, that made her more than the survivor she had become. In the halls of Westfield High, things weren't much better. Students whispered as she passed by, some offering nods of support, while others kept their distance. The once invisible Grace Harrison was now the center of attention, and it was suffocating. Her self-defense class, the one Daniel had encouraged her to start, had exploded in popularity. Students lined up to enroll. They wanted to learn how to defend themselves, yes, but also how to stand tall, how to reclaim the power they'd lost. But the real battle was still happening in the school's administration. Principal Murray was clinging to his position, though the pressure was mounting. The investigation had revealed years of negligence when it came to bullying, and now the world knew. It was no longer about one incident. It was about a system that had failed to protect its students for far too long. Grace hadn't spoken to her parents about what was happening behind the scenes at the school, but she knew that every time the phone rang, it was another meeting, another plan, another attempt to save face for the administration. One morning as Grace walked to her locker, she was intercepted by Mrs. Simmons, one of the teachers, who had remained quiet during the whole ordeal. Her usual smile was absent, replaced with a look of concern. "Grace," she said, voice low. "I need to talk to you about what's coming." "What's coming?" Grace asked, already feeling a tightness in her chest. "I've heard rumors. The board wants to settle this quietly to keep the school's reputation intact. But the problem is they don't want the truth to come out. They'll try to convince you that this is about forgiveness, about moving on, about keeping things quiet." Grace felt the weight of her decision bearing down. "What do you mean by settle?" They'll pressure you to say that the fight wasn't as bad as it seemed, that you were just defending yourself, but not as intensely. They'll try to make you second-guess everything. But don't listen to them, Grace. You have to keep your story straight. You have to make sure the truth comes out. Grace nodded, though the lump in her throat grew. I won't back down, she said, though she wasn't sure if she was convincing herself or Mrs. Simmons. Later that week, she found herself sitting in another meeting, this time with a new face. It was the school's lawyer, a woman named Janet Morrison, who had been hired to handle the fallout from the incident. Grace's parents were there, but the room was tense. Miss Harrison. The lawyer began flipping through a stack of papers. What's happening here is unprecedented. You've become a symbol, but the school board isn't handling it well. They want to come to an agreement to make this go away quietly. Grace's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, quietly? Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. They want you to drop any legal claims you may have, and they want you to publicly apologize for the violence. They're hoping that the media will move on to the next scandal, but we both know it's more than that. They want you to pretend like nothing happened, like the bullying was no big deal. Grace's pulse quickened. I'm not doing that. Of course not, Morrison replied, her voice firm. But the pressure is coming from every direction. There's talk of suspension, possible expulsion, and the social pressure at school is only going to get worse. I need to know if you're ready for this fight, because it's going to get ugly before it gets better. Grace swallowed hard. She glanced at her parents, both of them looking at her with support in their eyes. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had suffered in silence for years, about every moment that had been erased from history because no one spoke up. I'm ready, Grace said, her voice steady. But I want to know that we're going to hold them accountable. This isn't just about me. It's about Emma. It's about everyone who was pushed to the edge and couldn't fight back. Morrison nodded, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. Good, because I don't intend to back down either. At school, the tensions were rising. A few students, those who had been part of the bullying circle, had begun to challenge Grace. They whispered things behind her back, tried to belittle her in the hallways. But Grace was no longer the shy, quiet girl she had been before. She had a fire inside of her now, one that burned brighter every day. During one of her self-defense classes, a group of students gathered around her after practice. Grace. One of the girls said, I don't get it. Why didn't you just walk away? Grace looked at her heart, racing, but she kept her composure. Because walking away meant letting them win, and I couldn't do that anymore. The girl nodded, her eyes wide. You're right. I've always let them pick on me, and I never did anything. But after watching you, I'm not going to keep quiet anymore. Grace felt a sense of pride that she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just teaching techniques to protect herself physically. She was teaching her peers how to find their voices. She was giving them the courage to stand up just as she had. By the end of the week, Grace had made a decision. She wasn't going to let this story fade into the background. She wasn't going to be silenced by threats or pressure. She wasn't going to be made a scapegoat. She would keep fighting for the truth, for the students who had been ignored, for the ones who were too scared to speak. And most importantly, she would fight for Emma.